name's Mike Holt. I'm the communications director at the HDU. My eyes have recently been going on me. That's why I've got my glasses on my forehead because I'm going to have to put them on and off at times. The HDU is a really diverse healthcare union. We've got about 43,000 members in BC. A typical HDU member would be a woman. We've got about 90% of our members are female, and probably in their late 40s. So anyone whose mother an HDU member? Yes, yes. It's kind of surprising. There's usually some in every room, but we're a big industrial union. We've been through quite a lot over the last 10 years with the Campbell government. Our members have really been at the leading edge of suffering from cutbacks, privatization, and the attacks on labor rights. I'm going to talk a little more about that later because I think it's pretty relevant to the panel topic we have today. I think you heard a little bit about it from Judy. There's no question that workers and their unions are finding themselves in a more precarious situation than they ever had before. Suffice to say, if you're a federally regulated worker, like you work in the post office or an airline, you pretty well know that your right to strike has been effectively been removed by the federal government. Your employer has absolutely no reason to treat the collective bargaining process seriously. So unions are really under attack, and there's also a pretty well-coordinated attack on things like pensions. And really, all of these things are about driving a wedge between public sector workers and those who are struggling to provide for their retirement. In the court of public opinion, it's all about painting unions and the 32% of workers in this province who belong to unions as self-interested and out of touch, and out of touch with the 67% of workers who don't belong to unions. So really, it's about the 1% trying to divide the 32% from the 67%. And that's what we've got to fight. So, to some extent, the propaganda for the 1% is working. There was a couple of polls that were released in September around Labor Day, one in the US from the Gallup organization, which has been polling on this question since the 1930s, showed that American support for unions was pretty well at an all-time low, about 52%. In Canada, there was a similar poll that was done by Panelists research. It was done for a notoriously anti-union organization called Labour Watch, and it showed that only 52% of Canadians thought unions were relevant. Those are recent polls that show very lukewarm support for unions, but in contradiction to these numbers, unions are actually getting quite a lot of strong public support. So I don't know if you followed the news on this, but earlier this week, unions in Ohio had a remarkable victory. They've been working in coalition in the community to try and pass basically a ballot initiative that would strike down some very anti-union, anti-public sector union legislation that really restrict bargaining rights, the kind of things that they did in BC 10 years ago. And they were successful. You think about what the BC Teachers Federation is going through right now in its negotiations with the government. In the spring, the BCTF released a poll that showed that the public was very supportive of their bargaining demands around negotiating things like class size, the bargaining table. So in stark contradiction to these numbers, when the public sector unions and other unions are sort of engaged in values that the public support, like protecting public services, protecting education, protecting the right of workers to decent jobs and wages, they'll get public support. So they're more aligned with the values and the issues rather than the institutions, and that's important to remember. One really good example of that is what happened to our union. And I'm looking around the room and I'm wondering if some of you even remember this, but in 2004, there was a huge hospital strike in BC. There's probably about 25 to 30,000 hospital and long-term care workers on the picket line. Healthcare strikes are never pretty, especially for the unions that are involved in the strike, because the public feels very strongly about healthcare services. And it was an ugly strike. It went on for about 8 days. About 3 days into it, the government passed legislation. At the time, they had a huge majority in the legislature. And it was back-to-work legislation that also rolled wages back by about 15% for all of the workers who were on strike. So when that was all said and done, at the end of about 8 days, the media went out and did some polling, and they showed that the public supported the HEU and the other unions who were out on strike by a margin of about 2 to 1 over the government. And that's because I think the public really understood that the attack was unfair and it was really undermining the right of people to have a decent living. So when our values are aligned with the public values, we do pretty well. I think you probably So I think what this all shows us is it means that we need to be working with social movements and community organizations wherever appropriate and possible, and it means that we need to work as equal partners in a spirit of cooperation towards a common goal where labor doesn't pull the strings. And that's been a real learning process for the labor movement. I think in BC we actually don't do a bad job at that. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Code 378, they have had campaigns where they've aligned themselves with environmentalists, consumers, local communities around issues around hydro privatization with their Take Back the Power campaign. The BC Federation of Labor had a remarkably successful minimum wage campaign and working alone campaigns that engaged thousands of young people and others. The Fed's work, Lorene mentioned, on agricultural workers and forestry workers has forged important connections between the labor movement and multicultural organizations. The BCGEU, they've shown a lot of leadership behind the scenes with families, advocates, and other unions to raise issues around the heartbreaking crisis in community living, and that's now become a major political crisis for the government. QP, they've done a lot of great organizing with local communities and environmentalists to protect public water and wastewater utilities from privatization. HEU and many other unions are working in coalition with churches, seniors, other advocacy groups to improve seniors' care with their work with the BC Health Coalition, and now we're closer than ever to winning support for a seniors advocate, which would be very helpful in terms of what's going on in long-term care. All of these campaigns are strengthening the ties between unions and broader social movements, and over the long term, these campaigns are breaking down some of the stereotypes held by the public and the media about unions. And I also believe these campaigns can help renew and reinvigorate our union base. And one good example in our own union is the living wage campaign. I mean, I think most of you are aware of the broader living wage campaign in the community to try and get municipalities and other organizations to pass legislation or adopt bylaws that would force contractors to, would force the bodies themselves and any subcontractors they have for paying living wages. After the Campbell government was elected in 2001, within about 6 months, they passed a law that basically shredded the contracts that covered 90% of HE membership. That bill basically resulted within a couple of years of about 8,000 HE members being fired from their jobs. And most of these people worked in housekeeping, laundry, food services. And overnight, basically, we have thousands and thousands of workers who are now employed by multinational corporations at half the wages, very few benefits, they lost their pensions, and we had to do the very, very tough job of reorganizing those workers into a union. And one of the things we did early on is that we worked with community partners who were working on living wage campaigns to try and get our members involved with that, because it was pretty clear to us that we would not be able to sort of struggle to get those wages back to decent levels through the regular bargaining process. In healthcare, it was just too difficult with essential services, etc. So the living wage really reinvigorated our membership, and our members who weren't privatized, they also got pretty involved with the living wage campaign because they saw that the income inequality within our union that we were trying to address through the living wage campaign also affected their future economic security, because if there was 8,000 or 5,000, 6,000 HE members who were making 10 or 11 bucks an hour, what was going to happen to them at the bargaining table next time? So these things are very valuable. And it also allowed our union to make some valuable connections with multicultural organizations, with faith-based groups, and with others in the community who are working on these issues. So those alliances with the community are really important in terms of unions and public opinion. So I just want to I haven't talked much about unions and the relationship with the media. So I just want to touch on that very, very briefly. You know, clearly labor, like other progressive movements, aren't always able to penetrate the editorial filter in mainstream media. That's why we're all here this weekend. But I also I think it's too easy easy for us to always blame the mainstream media for not covering our stories. Sometimes we just don't do a very good job pitching them. And we all know that it's pretty tough for reporters these days. There's so few of them in the newsroom. We just have to work a little harder, I think, to present compelling and organized narratives. But as unions with considerable resources and large membership numbers, we also have a responsibility to expand the space where we can have a dialogue about the growing gap between the rich and poor, about the environment, about human rights. And the Occupy movement is clearly a part of that. And I'd just like to say that it's pretty significant and positive that the unions in the US and Canada have abandoned their traditional skittishness about getting involved with the movement with such undefined organizational structures. I don't think this would have happened 10 years ago, so that's very important. But there are a lot of other ways unions are expanding opportunities for dialogue. One is union newspapers. My back-of-the-napkin calculations say that union newspapers, the ones that are issued by province-wide unions like ours and the GEU and the BCTF and others, they probably have a circulation of about 250,000 in BC. And they probably, in the course of the year, print between 1 and 1.5 million issues of their newspapers. So it's a pretty significant reach that we have into union memberships. A lot of the staff who work on those newspapers come from a journalism background. The various papers in BC have very high journalistic standards and have dominated national labor media awards for the last decade, so that's really important to know. Support for alternative media. Our union, the HEU, and a lot of other BC unions are doing their part to support media projects like the Tiny Solutions Fund, Rabble.ca, Open Media, Out in Schools, the Documentary Film Festival, and things like that. We need to keep doing that. The ethnic media. BC unions have had mixed success in developing strong relationships with the ethnic media in BC. And I think we have to acknowledge that one of the challenges is that the big communication shops and BC unions haven't hired enough staff in the communities that we're trying to reach in the ethnic media. One great project, though, that a lot of BC unions have participated in, including BCGEU and ourselves, is one done by the Post papers, the South Asian Post, the Asian Pacific Post, the Filipino Post. They've been running a series for the last year and a half called My Life, My Union, and it's a chance for unions to profile their members who live in those communities to try and talk about their inspiring stories about how they got involved in their unions and became activists. And I really encourage you to go to one of their websites and read some of those stories. They're quite something. Advertising, BC unions are huge advertisers, but I'd say we could do more to coordinate our advertising buys to have a bigger impact on the public. Changing the frame of the discussion, BC unions are working with groups like the CCPA to develop a new framework for talking about issues like income inequality and tax fairness. And social media, I'll just briefly touch on this by saying I'm hugely interested in how we can use social media to organize and stuff, but I have to say that we did a recent survey of our members. We were giving away an iPad on our website. About 2,000 of our members filled in the survey. And what did it tell us? It told us that our members really like Facebook and almost none of them use Twitter. So, I think there's a lot of untapped potential in union memberships about how we can use these technologies. Don't know if we're quite there yet. But where there is a lot of potential, this is another interesting finding from our survey. Everybody's got a smartphone these days, and a lot of our members are using them, like 30% of them, to post videos and use Facebook. So I think we have a real potential in terms of mobilizing members to use that kind of technology. So I'm going to cut it short there because I'd really like to hear what you folks have to say about some of these issues, and thanks very much for listening.